The temperature is getting warmer, and if you have a yard, that means that it's time for some yard work. Fertilizing the lawn, raking out the winter leaves, planting annuals, and vegetable seeds. How do you feel about that? Some love the time that they spend out of doors, hands dirty with soil, helping things to grow. Others despise it and wish they hired someone to do the yard work or handed it off to a younger generation. This podcast is for that last group. In fact, the episode, which features Medcan's Dr. Lorne Greenspan and the gardening expert Mark Cullen, amounts to a conversation-long argument that gardening is one of the single best things you can do for your overall wellness. I'm Christopher Shulgin, the show's executive producer. Jasmine Ratch is off this week. Our guest in this episode is Mark Cullen. He's been broadcasting and writing about the gardening experience since the early 80s. He's written 24 books, including 2 biographies, and today, Mark and his son Ben produce a bi-weekly podcast, The Green File. Write weekly for the Toronto Star and syndicate to 31 other newspapers across Canada, and publish a monthly newsletter that is distributed to 22,000 Canadians. In 2016, Mark was awarded the Order of Canada for his connections with everyday Canadians through his gardening and environmental messages. Mark is interviewed in this episode by his longtime physician, Dr. Lorne Greenspan of Medcan, who adds a medical perspective to this episode's exploration of the wellness benefits of having a green thumb. So without further ado, here's Dr. Lorne Greenspan in conversation with Mark Cullen.
Well, today it's our good fortune to have Mark Cullen, whose voice I'm sure everybody will recognize. Mark has been a tremendous advocate across our country for gardening, and he brings a wealth of knowledge and experience. So it's my pleasure to have Mark join us. Before we get started on the actual content, you must be very excited. We're into spring. We got a chance for renewal. So why don't you tell us how you entered the world of gardening? What are the things that help formulate your passion, your interest, and your knowledge?
Well, that's a great question, and I am delighted to be here. You're absolutely right, not only because it's spring, but because you're here. And I'm saying that quite sincerely because, you've been my doctor for I don't know how many years, and this is just a wonderful new context for us to have a conversation where maybe I actually get to give you advice. And that's going to be kind of fun. That's the part I'm looking forward to.
Don't beat me up if I don't have any knowledge.
I'll tell you what, tit for tat, all right?
Fair good.
People can judge for themselves. Yeah. My career can be summed up in terms of the genesis of my interest in gardening, in terms of my relationship with my father, which was a wonderful relationship. He was a career gardener. He met a British gardener, a very fascinating individual by the name of John Wheel, when he was delivering newspapers as a teenager in North Toronto. And he delivers a newspaper to John Wheel one day. John meets him at the door in 1942, and my dad's 16 years old. And he says, "Leonard, I'm digging up some perennials this Sunday afternoon. Will you come over to my place and help me? I got to take them over to Mrs. Brown's and plant them in her garden." And my dad says, "Well, sure," because it was a little more pin money, right? And that was how it all started. And those two became the best of friends for a lifetime. John lived to his 100th year. He is a perfect example of how gardening helps you create a better quality of life, and in his case, a nice long life. And this is a survivor of the First World War. He signed up with 150 guys in 1914 in Nottinghamshire, and he and one other guy came back at the end of the war. That's a wonderful little snapshot of John Wheel and an example of what a wonderful person, and lucky, perhaps, too, that he was. And he was a natural teacher. He got my dad started. My dad got me started. And it took a while, but I fell in love with the whole genre.
That's an amazing story because I think it represents a lot of the important values that we are able to transfer from parent to child. And it's through not words, it's through action. So one of the things Medcan is engaged in is the whole concept of health and wellness. And consistency is a very important part of all of that. And you're probably familiar with our theme, eat, move, think.
Yeah.
And when I was looking at the topic, immediately I could see the relevance of gardening to all of those matters. So maybe you could talk to us on each of that categories and thoughts that you may have, experiences that you've undergone that would support that.
Well, starting with eat is so simple. When you think about the gardening experience, especially for millennials, for, your kids and mine and the ones in their 20s and 30s who are only beginning to get a notion of, maybe I should start a tomato plant or whatever, right? It's almost always about food. It almost never starts with, I'm going to go get a rose bush and put it out in the balcony. It's always about food. And the growth in our industry has been phenomenal, about 20% since the beginning of COVID. Ooh. So, it was growing to begin with. And what COVID did was it just sort of sped up this interest that Canadians and North Americans generally have in horticulture. But when you break it down and you look at it by category, lawns, evergreens, trees, shrubs, food's by far the fastest growing segment within the whole genre. And I don't want to assume that listeners to this podcast know the health benefits of growing their own food. But think about it this way. You're growing your own tomato. That means you have control over what chemicals are used or not used. You can grow completely organically. You can pick the fruit when it's ready, and there's no transport from California where they strip mine tomatoes and bring them up into Canada. Instead, you're eating it within minutes. And herbs, let's say you live in a condominium on a balcony, or you have a rooftop garden. There's nothing more productive than a window box full of herbs on a square foot basis, whether you want to slice that economically or in terms of the volume of produce that you actually get to bring into the kitchen. So there are many health benefits relative to food.
So let me just jump in on that, because as you know, part of my responsibility to my patients is to talk about food and to talk about any diet that confers some benefit, whether it's physical benefit, whether it's cognitive benefit, whether it's emotional benefit. And we now know that the Mediterranean diet, which is basically a plant-based diet adding fish and some other healthy components, is really what lowers long-term risk. Heart disease, stroke, diabetes, inflammatory diseases is also now touted. So this is all from your patio, your garden, things that you can do to really give yourself the pleasure of gardening with the benefits to health.
I think it's interesting to me to hear you sort of express a lot of feelings and knowledge I have about growing food, but in a medical or scientific term, because I'm not a medic and I'm not a scientist. I'm just a gardening guy who translates and enables Canadians and Americans, for that matter, enables them to get out and engage in the gardening activity and maximize their success. That's all I do. I just filter information. And that's really cool, I think, what you just said.
Well, let's move on to move. What are the things that you experience when you're actually gardening? Talk to me about the physicality of gardening.
Well, I wrote a column for the Toronto Star that was titled Gardening Grunts. And when you and I don't think we should apologize for the grunting that goes on in the gardening, because let's face it, and I'm speaking more perhaps to listeners who are in our age bracket, Lorne. You go outside, you bend over to pull a weed, you take a wheelbarrow, you fill it with soil. There's a lot of grunting that goes on, let's face it. And to me, I think that we need to give more credit to the movement that's required to garden successfully. And this isn't hyper activity. This is not the same thing as running 5 kilometers, right? It's something that is gradual, that increases your flexibility, increases your strength, and increases the satisfaction one gets from the experience, because it's not the same thing as hiring a gardener to come in and do it for you, right? When you are physically responsible for that job, at the end of the day, you can reward yourself with whatever, whether that's a, piece of chocolate or a beer or whatever your little pleasure is, because you've earned it. You actually went out and you did something physical and you earned it.
Well, that's a very interesting approach. And I think you brought up something that I would like to even expand upon. And that is anything that gets your heart rate up is going to be aerobically healthy. And yes, we're lifting. Yes, we're bending. Yes, we're being flexible. Yes, we're using strength. But we're also increasing our heart rate. And in fact, studies show that 30 minutes of gardening is equivalent of moderate to intense aerobic exercise. So we've now been able to accomplish the WHO guideline, the Health Canada guideline, and the American Academy of Sports Medicine guideline. So we're getting this pleasure without what we perceive as that, oh, I'm forced to go to the gym to do this. No, I've been productive. I've been enjoying what I've done, and I've accomplished my fitness daily requirement. So I think it's an awesome way of kind of combining all things. So that's one of the things that's interesting. But another one that's really come to the forefront is we now know that sitting for more than 6 hours a day is equivalent to smoking. It doubles your risk of a heart attack or stroke. Wow. Well, when you're gardening, you get out of a chair, walk to your garden, and then you're active. So it actually pulls people away from risk. Not only does it create value by the doing, it creates value by pulling you away from what is bad.
Right.
So there's a lot of intrinsic value on the move side as well. So why don't we get into the think part?
Well, before we do, I just want to make an observation because listening to you is not the same as listening to me. And the reason is that you sound like a personal trainer when I listen to you. Like you're the guy measuring the need for me to like add another 5 kilograms to the weights or whatever, right? Faster, stronger and all that stuff. That's not what goes through my head when I go out in the garden. You know what goes through my head is today I want to get the tomatoes in the ground. Today I'm going to weed. Today I'm going to get the weeds under control. And I'm more focused on the destination than the physicality of getting there, right? And you're absolutely right, everything you're saying. And I know you're right, but it's certainly not on my mind when I go out there and turn my mind to the task.
Well, mine's the reverse. I go out there saying I'm going to get my physicality, and if I'm lucky, that tomato will grow. Okay, so those are the opposite skills that we have, right? But
oh, well, that's true, but that sounds very Canadian, what you just said. Because when we fail at growing a really nice tomato, we always blame ourselves. Canadians tend to. This is our reputation, right? And I know that's a very broad statement, but the truth is we can minimize the risks and we can maximize the chances of growing the first tomato on the block, if that's your goal, right? By just arming ourselves with knowledge.
Yeah, great point. So let's go to the things. Since you just talked about knowledge, it leads us perfectly into the think part.
Right.
What are the elements that you bring on the cognitive side? What are you thinking about as you plan your day in the garden?
Well, the first thing I think about is how to uncomplicate the situation. You know, here it is spring. And I can't tell you how long my list is of things I want to do in the garden right now, today. And when I get up in the morning and when I have that time available to go out and do some of those things, the first thing I need to do is discipline myself to prioritize what is important. What do I have to do this time of year if I want to succeed in July or August or September when the tomatoes are coming in? And I keep using tomatoes just because everybody knows what a tomato is. So organizing my thinking is very important. And the other thing I want to mention is the wonderful gift that we have in this northern hemisphere called winter. When and I mean this quite sincerely, we forget that we get 4 months off in Canada. Some provinces would get 5 months on, northern United States as well, right? And this is a wonderful gift because it provides us with the opportunity to connect with all those sources of information that arm me with the knowledge I need for the other 8 months of the year to go out and actually succeed in the garden. So we need to take that time. I'm quite sincere about this. We need to take the time to find out what is it that a tomato plant requires because it has certain requirements, and I'm going to mention sunshine as one. Number one, minimum 6 hours sun. If you don't know that, you plant it on the north side of the house or under a tree, you're going to fail. Guaranteed you're going to fail. So how is that for think?
I love that because essentially my approach to medicine is exactly the same. It doesn't end with today. It actually starts with the future and moves backwards. So I'm looking at where are the risks downstream that I have to contend with and address today. So if I'm able to do that, I'm able to remove a certain number of risks by addressing the healthy approach from today forward. And now it minimizes my downstream risk profile. When I look at think, I also look at productivity because if you think well, you are more productive physically, emotionally, and mentally. Sleep's important. And to get in the garden, you have to feel energized. And if you're not, you probably will lapse that day into making either less efficient or proficient decisions. The work you do will not be as economical, etc. So I just like to say, what would I be able to do in totality to make this a good gardening day?
Right. I think that's a good question, and a good question for listeners to pose to themselves as they venture out into the garden or onto the apartment condo balcony to planting containers, which we can talk about. However, I do want to say this. The gardening experience is different from virtually any other experience you'll have because when we talk about productivity, which is a word that scares me a little bit in the garden, because in the garden, failure is part of our learning experience. And it's only through failure that we find out that, so my tomato actually does need more sun, or I need to prune it back come late June or around Father's Day. I should be out there pruning my tomato. And so by accepting failure, we've accepted something that is generally not accepted in our society. We're not allowed, or certainly we're not praised for failure in our business, failure raising our family, failure wherever. Like you can name it. But in the garden? All right, I just learned something. That wasn't a failure. That was a composting opportunity.
Well, it's amazing when I hear you talk about gardening, the parallels to medicine, because when I engage a patient, we're starting today. Today is a new day. Today is an opportunity. And the things that you may not have either understood or things that you had done that you were aware of that are counterproductive, we get a chance all over again today to say, let's go in stages. You pick the stage you want to achieve for health, for risk reduction, and I'll help you get there. And that's essentially what you're doing with your readers, with your listeners, is saying, today is a new day. What have you learned from yesterday or the past that we can correct? So I love your approach, and that's, for me, the opportunity, just as you said, to get better, to learn.
Here's an exercise I'd like our listeners at this very moment to engage in. I'd like everybody to remove from their hard drive somewhere this image that they have of a beautiful garden. And if you would do that, you don't have to share it. This is your image, so it's very private, right? And the people in the room, there's 4 of us here, each of us has a different image of what a beautiful garden is. And my question is, what are you going to do to achieve that image? And I want to suggest to you that you won't do it in a year. You might not do it in a lifetime. And that's what makes the gardening experience different as well. Unique in many respects, in that it's an art form that is constantly changing. And it's constantly changing because of the partnership we have with nature. So you have this image of a beautiful garden. I'm going to suggest maybe a perennial border like that you'd find in Britain in one of their beautiful public gardens, right? Which they have over 1,000 public paid admission gardens, and in Canada we have 12. So it tells you a little bit about their passion, right? But my point is they just accept that they can do that, right? Do this beautiful perennial border. How do you do that? And the answer is not simple. The answer can be quite complicated, and learning to do it could be a lifetime journey.
Well, again, as you know, in medicine is one of those fields that is explosive
Right.
in its knowledge because of innovation, the technology, etc. And it's the same thing. It looks easy to get to the answer, but it's not. The answer had to be struggle, but the struggle is always worth it. It's always worth it. So,
and there are mistakes made along the way?
Always, in fact, that's where the real learning comes from, is the intellect to recognize that you've now gone down the wrong road,
right,
but not giving up.
Right.
What did I learn about that endpoint that will take me back to a different route? So, again, medicine, gardening, there's so many similarities.
Yeah.
You know, just on that note, I'm going to just throw out some things that I think we are appreciative, but plants offer so many advances in medicine. So we know that there are drugs that have helped from the cardiac standpoint, digitalis from foxglove, for example.
Right.
We have salicylic acid or aspirin that comes from the willow bark. We've got saw palmetto that we use for prostate. We've got tomatoes, lycopene for prostate, reduce risk.
Right.
I can go on and on because there is no endpoint to the contribution that plants, herbs make to health. And when I was in Peru leading a medical conference, we had herbalists come from Peru with their array of natural healing products that came from plants. And it was incredible to listen to their expertise and their stories on the application, topical, oral, etc. So I think we're going to learn a lot more than we currently know about the value of the garden to health.
Absolutely.
So I'm just going to fire a few questions at you now. We've had a great discussion to this point. I'm learning, and I want to continue to learn. So can you just talk a little bit about the effect of gardening on our communities?
Well, absolutely. You know, the benefits of gardening cut so many different ways. It's economic, it's social, it's environmental. And the one you're touching on here that I'm very passionate about is the social aspect of gardening. And what I say about gardening, and I've written a chapter actually in my latest book, Escape to Reality, gardening cures shyness. So you take a shy person, and we all know a shy person. Maybe we have a listener or two that would consider themselves to be shy people. The cure for shyness through the garden is this. You take a room full of people, just an eclectic mix of any people, and you put a gardener in among them. There are always questions. It's a little bit like being the doctor in the room. Only it's more permissible to ask gardening questions, the medical questions in that environment, right? And the second thing is that when you get two or more gardeners together, they have endless things to talk about. A good example of this is the incredible success of horticultural societies over the last couple hundred years here in North America. What is the purpose of a horticultural society? Well, they will give you all kinds of reasons, but I would suggest the number one reason for them getting together is to get together. And what are they doing? Well, like they're having a great time, right? And they're talking about how they grew the earliest tomato on the block or whatever it is. They suddenly you have this cure for shyness. You have a social environment that revolves around nature and gardening, and you can't avoid it.
You know, I think that for myself, I watch people when they get together, and gardening brings a smile. There are topics that don't bring smiles to people's face. I've never seen anybody talk about gardening with a frown. That's number one. The other thing that's interesting is when my wife and I go anywhere, we always go looking for gardens. I've got a daughter in Dallas. We go to the Arboretum there. Every single time we visit, my daughter has a membership. We go strolling through the gardens, and the joy that we get is immeasurable. But the other thing that's interesting, if we ever have an argument and get into a garden, the argument stops immediately. There's a mood effect that kind of starts to take positivity into the relationship. So I find that I'm more relaxed in a garden.
Could I tell you a little story that I think fits with exactly what you're saying? And I hope you don't mind me bringing this up, but I was awarded the Order of Canada in 2016, and when I went up for the investiture, the Governor General David Johnston was giving the awards, right? And I think it was probably in alphabetical order. My last name's Cullen, so I was somewhere in the first third of the group, right? This investiture ceremony is very serious, very solemn. And as he's pinning this award on this variety of people, and there were probably about 70 of us that day receiving our award, you know what happened when he gave me mine? The entire room laughed. And
wow.
It was the nicest. I don't mean that. I took it as a compliment.
Yeah.
And they didn't laugh, ha-ha, but there was this sort of tickle went through the room, like a moment of not being so serious. And there are, by the way, a lot of medical people there, who are curing cancer and doing all kinds of wonderful things. But to your point about gardening, I received my award and people just suddenly loosen up at the mention. It had nothing to do with me personally. It had everything to do with the mention of gardening in that atmosphere, which was otherwise very serious.
Well, you must be very heartened at being a gardener, because when you start to look at kind of creativity in a broader sense, you start to see gardens in the art world left, right, and center. I mean, you look at Monet and his paintings, you look at many others who've painted works in a garden. And then you look at literature, and there's books that have titles with the garden.
Yeah.
Right? And you look at photography, and there's gardens everywhere, or flowers and bees and birds. And so the garden seems to give creativity beyond just the gardening part itself.
Well, that's true. We're broadcasting at this very moment, just footsteps away from Bay Street in Toronto, right? The financial heartbeat of the country. Why do so many of the companies in these high-rises take a name related to horticulture, whether it's like an oak tree, or Desjardins? Like, what is that? Think about it. It's a French word. It's got something to do with gardens, I think, right? Yeah. And yet they do that, and they do that for a reason. Maybe you can tell me what it is.
Well, what do they say the definition of gardening? It's a practice of planting, growing, and cultivating plants. Well, it's cultivating more than plants. It's cultivating your mind, opportunities, engagement. I mean, a lot of things I could expand on, but that's not that I'm more knowledgeable than anybody else in word speak here. But gardening connotes a rejuvenation, a healthy kind of outlook, productivity, things that matter to people. You
know why? If I may sort of answer my own question here.
You're better than me at this.
I'll pose the question. And the question is, what is the garden? Like, what are we talking about? And what you just gave us was the Webster's definition, right? Which is technically correct. I wouldn't argue with it. But I believe that the garden is the conduit or the connection that Canadians, Americans, have to nature. So it doesn't matter if you're on the 17th floor of a high-rise apartment or condominium and you go out onto your balcony to water your tomato plant. Again, there's that tomato plant. It doesn't matter whether you're doing that or you're going out the back door of your house into, like in my case, a 1-acre garden to do whatever. Maybe to water my tomato plants, right? Doesn't matter precisely the environment. What we're doing is we're connecting ourselves to a piece of nature. And as North Americans, and especially Canadians, I think this is really, really valuable because we're surrounded by nature. And even you, with your medical, scientific background and knowledge, would agree. We are, as human beings, a part of nature, but we seem on a daily basis to make an effort to separate ourselves from it, right? Like this room we're in right now. So what does gardening do? It provides an opportunity to reconnect to the real world.
I love that because, in fact, more and more of medicine is actually saying we as humans are symbiotic with our own bodies. If you took away all the bacteria, all the other organisms within or on top of our body, you would not have a healthy person. We have to learn that we work with other elemental organisms to make our bodies work.
Right.
So that's on the micro scale, and you're talking on the macro, and I completely agree with you. You know, it's interesting that there are projects now in Toronto, and I'll mention Allied Properties with Bjorky Ingalls, are doing a project down right at the lakefront that involves landscape gardens on every floor, and they're affiliated with the condo itself. And that is not just because it's mandated. It's not mandated. It's because we realize that people benefit from ecological exposure, from ecological interconnectivity.
Well, I'm sure that's very true, but every office environment benefits from the existence of houseplants, indoor plants, call them what you like, tropical plants, and it boosts productivity. And if you want any help with that, let me know.
Well, I'm going to just carry on with the community benefits. Medcan is always open to any great ideas related to health, believe me.
Well, I said productivity, right? That's not even my favorite word.
Well, you're right.
We know it's true.
Yeah, well, that's a good one. Well, just on that note, I'm going to expand to the community at large. And we had just had a moment before we started, and we talked about, is there a benefit to the community in forms of crime reduction or binding communities for pride, for productivity? And it's been shown in various constituencies in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Compton, California, and Waterloo, where studies have done looking at the reduction in crime when you landscape vacant properties. And the production of crime, and in particular violent crime, goes way down. The other thing that's interesting, and this is certainly research by me, not experience by me. I'm not a sociologist, but they looked at land value that has well landscaped property and the impact it has to the value of that house. And this is an English study, and you mentioned England being focused on the importance of gardens or floral kind of arrangements, etc. For 3,500 euros, you can increase your property up to 77%. So when you talk about what kind of unexpected benefits come from gardening, it could be in value, I mean, in absolute concrete value. So, Mark, we've covered an awful lot of territory, and I really appreciate the scope to which you brought the aspect of gardening. So maybe you could give us hints that you think would benefit a novel gardener, somebody who's just starting out, who's got some interest or enthusiasm, but really doesn't know how to really get into it and make it purposeful or productive.
So back to the snapshot. Remember, you have a snapshot in your head, and all of us do, of a beautiful garden. And the question becomes, if you don't mind me saying this, how do I get there? Like, what are the steps and what are the hurdles I need to jump over in order to get there? And the first answer always is soil. Understanding the value of good soil and understanding just how difficult solid clay can be, as an example. There are other types of soil that can be a problem. And what you need to do in order to change the environment beneath the surface of the soil so that the roots thrive. So there's an optic that gets us in trouble, and that is we think about the green living world around us, right? Without thinking a great deal about the roots that support it. And I want listeners today to think about the roots first. You want that green, you want that productivity from your tomato plant, you want the pollinators in your perennial garden. Think about the roots first. The roots grow in soil. The soil needs to be good quality, well-drained stuff. Right? And I could go on about it. I wrote a whole book about it, actually. So I'll leave it at that for now and just suggest arm yourself with the knowledge that you need to enhance the soil to maximize the productivity of your garden. That's number one. Number two, match the environment where you want to plant with the plant you choose to put there. Right? And the most obvious and sometimes frequently overlooked is sunshine or shade, like whatever it is, if it's under the shade of a tree. And by the way, I've had people say to me, I wish I could garden, but I can't garden. My garden's total shade. Well, my response to that is you haven't explored it very carefully, because there's so many plants that thrive in shade. And nature teaches us, all you have to do is go for a walk in a park with a woodland and see what's growing there. And you'll see trilliums very soon, within a month, right? We'll see trilliums. We'll see all kinds of native plants that grow in the shade. Just make sure wherever you're growing, you match those cultural requirements of the plant with the actual location. So those two things are essential. The third thing is water. Now, there can be too much water. There can be too little water. And right now, there's very strong movement afoot right across North America towards rain gardens and pollinator gardens. And in essence, a rain garden is a garden which in spring is kind of sopping wet, because that's spring. April showers bring May flowers. It's also melting snow and all that kind of stuff. And then come July, heat hits home, and many parts of our continent get really, really dry. You can have a garden that requires virtually no water from the hand of humankind, if you plan it properly, right? So a rain garden is sort of a self-sustaining garden that will attract pollinators, etc., later in the season after they've become established. So you water a plant when it's first put in the ground from time to time as needs be. But if you've planned this properly, the plant becomes self-sustaining, and you don't have to do that anymore. And the other thing is, what is a rain garden, a pollinator garden? It's a garden that is dominated by native plants. And that's almost a whole another topic.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to just add my hints from more of a medical side. So one of the things that people do in a garden, they squat. And squatting is not necessarily good, because you stand up, you get lightheaded, dizzy, and you may actually faint. So I recommend people limit their squatting, get themselves a comfortable cushion or some other resting place for the knee, and kneel. The other thing that will provide you, meaning having a comfortable resting place, is it will prevent housemaid's knee. Because if you kneel on hard surfaces for long enough, you'll get bursitis. So avoid squatting, use a pad or a pillow, kneel.
Kneel with one knee or two? You
can do both.
Okay.
It doesn't matter. The other thing is, don't assume one position for extended periods of time, because muscles fatigue and you will ultimately pay a price with cramping. So make sure you adjust positions throughout. When you're doing any heavy lifting, make sure you engage your core, because we don't want people to suffer back pain. So engage your core. If you have allergies, and I deal with allergies, there are 3 seasons of allergies. One is now, there's another that comes with grass, and then there's the ragweed later on. People use short-acting antihistamines like Benadryl. Do not do that anymore. That's gone. They are sedating, they are short-acting, they don't provide benefit. Use a long-acting like Reactin or Claritin. And if you know you're seasonally challenged, then start a week before the season and continue right through the season. Don't worry about overusing it. You are not. You're actually providing yourself with a benefit with no dependency. If you have anaphylaxis, and the most common would be to Hymenoptera, so bees, hornets, wasps, etc., you better have 2 anakits, EpiPens, available. You don't want to say, well, if something happens, I can get to the hospital in time. You have to treat that immediately. So make sure you've got 2. 1 to use, and if you need the backup, you've got it. Sunscreen. Everybody likes a tan, but nobody likes wrinkles. The only way to stop that is protect. And remember to hydrate. You're going to be outside. It's going to be hot. Often you're engaged. You don't think about restoring your volume, but make sure you do. So, Mark, I'd like to thank you for your contribution today. I think there's nobody I could think of who I'd rather sit across from me on this topic. So we value highly what you had to say today. We appreciate your time, and we look forward to your books, your podcasts, new businesses that are exploring new territories, etc. So anytime you have anything that you would like to add, we'd be more than happy to bring you back. So thanks again.
That's wonderful. Thanks very much, Lorne. And what a great opportunity this has been for me, and it's been a lot of fun.
That was the gardening expert Mark Cullen in conversation with Medcan's Dr. Lorne Greenspan, his longtime physician. We'll post links to Mark's website, his social feeds, his gardening podcast, and his books at our website, eatmovethinkpodcast.com, where you can also find time-pegged episode insights. Remember to rate and subscribe to Eat Move Think on your favorite podcast platform. Follow Medcan on Twitter and Instagram at MedcanLiveWell. Say hello and send us a tip or a suggestion by emailing us at info@eatmovethinkpodcast.com. Eat Move Think is produced by Ghost Bureau. Senior producer is Russell Gregg. Jasmine Ratch is managing producer. Social media and strategy support is from Chantal Gertan and Andrew Imax, and executive producer is me, Christopher Scholgen. We'll be back soon with a new episode examining the latest in health and wellness.
This podcast is intended to provide general information about health and wellness only and is not designed or intended to constitute or be used as a substitute for medical advice, treatment, or diagnosis. You should always talk to your Medcan healthcare provider for individual medical advice, diagnosis, and treatment, including your specific health and wellness needs. This podcast is based on the information available at the time of preparation and is only accurate and current as of that date. Source information and recommendations are subject to change based on scientific evidence as it evolves over time. Medcan is not responsible for future changes or updates to the information and recommendations and assumes no obligation to update based on future developments. Reference to or mention of specific treatments or therapies does not constitute or imply a recommendation or endorsement. The links provided within the associated document are to assist the reader with the specific information highlighted. Any third-party links are not endorsed by Medcan.